Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice in commemoration of Jane Austen July. Uh, we're reading the whole of this instead of just talking about it, and I'm having a blast. And that is, after all that counts. And in our story so far, uh, Jane Bennet is laid up sick at Netherfield Hall, surrounded by Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy and Bingley's sisters and their servants and their friends and whatnot, their in-laws. They are doting on Jane. They like her. The women might cut her up the back when she's not listening, but they do like her. They do think it's impossible not to like Jane. And she has a bad cold, so she is in bed. And worried about her, her sister Elizabeth treks over the land from her home in Longbourn to Netherfield to tend to her sister, and then sends back home. When she finds Jane particularly poorly, she sends back home for more clothes because she's going to make a stay of it. She's going to stay until her sister's better. Uh, we saw in the last chapter that Mrs. Bennet eventually comes to Netherfield Hall to see whether or not her daughter is dying and finds that she is just sick with a cold. Her intuition was correct. Young people don't die of cold. So she wasn't overly worried. And she is overly concerned, very concerned, with marrying her daughters. Well, she has 5 daughters. She has no money of her own, effectively. And the home where they live, Longbourn, is not theirs once Mr. Bennet dies. It goes into the hands of someone else who's not going to want them around. We're going to meet that someone else. There's a lot of stories still to go. But right now we are still at Netherfield Hall. And as chapter 10 dawns, I am happy to report to you that Jane is improving. At long last, this pale little willow is improving. You can imagine that Lizzie Bennet would not have been in bed for 1 hour with this cold. But Jane is finally getting better, which is going to allow Jane Austen a little luxury. We saw in the end of last chapter that the 2 younger Bennet daughters are lightly castigated. Surely you wouldn't want to have a ball or a dance while Jane is sick in bed, and they grudgingly allowed that. No, they wouldn't want to do that. But the same is true for Jane Austen. She doesn't quite want to engage in her full range of her favorite thing, which is intelligent frivolity. She doesn't want to engage in that as a writer while she's got a favorite character sick in bed. But now that Jane is getting better, she can indulge in it. And that's what she does in chapter 10, which sparkles. So I'll try to do it justice. I don't know how you people are putting up with my reading voice, but you seem to be not minding. So chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, that's Jane, who continued, though slowly, to mend. And in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. No cell phones. Not a cell phone in sight, just all living their full life. The most annoying thing here, of course, is not any of the activities. It's Miss Bingley, who really is the tar heel of this whole book. She's watching Darcy write a letter and commenting to him while he does it. Can you think of anything more annoying? Elizabeth took up some needlework and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of the lady, either on his handwriting or on the evenness of his lines or on the length of his letter, were with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each. So she has formed opinions of Darcy. And she is making a fuss over needlework, but she's really just watching, because she knows he's uncomfortable. Again, the stuff that's not being narrated here, the lack of stage management, allows me to daydream that Darcy and Elizabeth are exchanging pointed looks about Bingley, about Caroline Bingley, in simpatico with each other. If you start to imagine those looks, the dialogue in this whole chapter changes. And there's nothing in the text that says you can't imagine that. Anyway, let's move on here. How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter. That's Miss Bingley. Darcy made no reply. You write so uncommonly fast. You are mistaken. I write rather slowly. How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year. Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them. It is fortunate, then, that they are fault my lot instead of yours. If Pemberley is a big, busy estate, Darcy probably doesn't write a lot of those letters himself. But well, maybe he does. Maybe he's a control freak. That'd be bad news for somebody in this book. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I have already told her so once by your desire. I am afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well. Keep in mind, we're not talking about an actual ballpoint pen, or the greatest invention in all of humankind, the multicolor ballpoint pen. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something that you constantly have to take a penknife and wick it into a sharp shape. Thank you, but I always mend my own. How can you contrive to write so even? Darcy was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite enraptured with her beautiful little design for a table, and I think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Notice, Caroline Bingley is talking all about the accomplishments that Bingley was sarcastically, that his brother was sarcastically mentioning just earlier. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I have no room to do them justice. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? Okay, a little bit of information there. At least one part of the party is leaving in January. They are, or she's coming here, or Darcy's sister is coming here. They are generally long, but whether always charming, it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy? My style of writing is very different from yours. Oh, cried Miss Bingley, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest. This is fun. This is joshery. And it's being done right in front of Elizabeth, which I think means more than is being given credit, and is usually given credit by the readers of this book. But as to how much she's accepted at Netherfield. But another thing I want to point out is look at the leisure of this. This is Jane Austen feeling relieved that Jane is doing well. My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. Picture them looking at each other. Picture that Darcy's not looking at Bingley, that he's looking at Elizabeth. Picture the electricity here. This is why you should read this carefully, and why you should not be caught off guard by the romantic hijinks that are going to come, and that strike inattentive readers of this book as coming out of nowhere. Again, Jane Austen is not writing stage directions. If she were, what a scene this would be. If only she were Trollope. But anyway. And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast, for you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and a carelessness of execution, which if not estimable, you at least think highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric, in other words, a hymn of praise, of compliment to yourself. And yet where is there so very laudable in a precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? This is Bingley's best friend, talking to him. Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning. Bingley has a very winning Bertie Wooster air about him. And yet, upon my honor, I believed what I said of myself to be true. I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of a needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know. And if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you would probably do it. You would probably not go, and, at another word, might stay a month. You have only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off how much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on such sweetness of my temper, but I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend. for he would certainly think the better of me if, under such circumstances, I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as intoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. Look at the badinage going on here between the three of them. Notice also, just as a side note, how thoroughly forgotten Carolyn Bingley is. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house and the delay of his plan has merely desired it, asked it, without offering one argument in favor of its propriety. To yield readily, easily to persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship or affection. A regard for the requester would often make one readily yield to a request without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I'm not particularly speaking of any such case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, till the circumstance occurs before we discuss the discretion of his behavior thereupon. But in general and ordinary cases between friend and friend, where one of them is destined by the other to change a resolution to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with the desire without waiting to be argued into it? Will it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley. You know he's enjoying this. You know they all three of them are. Let us all hear about the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare I do not know a more awful subject than Darcy. That is, in the text it's A-W-E-F-U-L, so it's not awful as in horrible. It's awful as in inspiring awe. On particular occasions and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening when he has nothing to do. Again, a mention of Pemberley. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received, and in an expostulation with her brother for talking in such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You dislike an argument and want to silence this. Bingley's just being frivolous, I think, talking about how he takes Darcy more seriously because Darcy is taller. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours till I'm out of the room, I shall be very thankful. Then you may say whatever you like of me. Notice, Bingley is saying that this discussion is between the two of them. He's even suggesting they would carry it on when he left the room, when maybe everyone leaves the room. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy has much better finish his letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negatived, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. I don't doubt it. When has he had conversation like that from anyone? Not just in the country, but in London. When has he had conversation like that from any woman? Much less a pretty young woman. Anyway, she hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man. And yet, that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last that she drew his notice because there was a something about her wrong and reprehensible, according to his ideas of right, and than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm with a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. Nobody ignores Darcy. Oh, said she, I heard you before. I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But always I delight in overthrowing those kinds of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all, and now despise me if you dare. Indeed, I do not dare. No, he doesn't, because that is exactly... Anyway, I don't want to stage manage myself. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. How much is encompassed in that one sentence? Not only his priggishness, that he holds her family, specifically her mother, against her, but also the danger here is that he would fall in love with her. And how horrible that would be, to, as we're going to hear later on, pollute the shades of Pemberley. Miss Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous. I don't doubt it. She's a malicious, vicious little idiot. Elizabeth Bennet doesn't even realize that she is competing with Miss Bingley. There's no competition whatsoever. And her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage, planning his happiness in such an alliance. Remember, she's already teased him about this. I hope, said she, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, you will give your mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after officers. And, if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavor to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses. No one will ever check that in our Lizzie. Never. It'll never happen. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity? Oh, yes. Do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great uncle, the judge. They're in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. Again, mocking the profession of Elizabeth's uncle. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? Because Darcy's already mentioned beautiful eyes. And she just won't let him hear the end of it. It would not be easy, indeed, to capture their expression, but their color and shape and the eyelashes, so remarkably fine, might be copied. At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. I did not know that you intended to walk, said Miss Bingley in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. And who's this they business? It's lest she had been overheard, flatly insulting Elizabeth and her family. The shrubbery mustn't be mistaken for some sort of enormous hedge maze at Versailles. It would be easily possible, given the acoustics of the day, a still day, to hear what someone had said just on the other side of 4 inches of growth. It appears they did not. Although Jane Austen taunts for one line, she taunts with the reader just a bit, because the very next line after Miss Bingley is worried about having been overheard is, "You used us abominably ill." That is a sign. That's a little sign. Jane Austen doesn't often do this, especially in Pride and Prejudice. It's a little sign of how consummately she controls what she's doing. For just a second, the reader's heart skips a beat, thinking, "You used us abominably ill." In other words, we did overhear you. But no. "You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "in running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, "No, no, stay where you are. You're charmingly grouped, and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Goodbye." She then ran off gaily, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being at home again in a day or two. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. And that ends chapter 10, which is a neat foreshadowing of another scene with couples walking together in line or in procession in a shrubbery. It's going to take place later on, and then another scene, much like the same thing that happens at the very end of the book. But notice, Elizabeth is completely unconscious of the effect she's having on Darcy. When he can't take his eyes off her at the piano, she thinks it's because he finds a defect that isn't true with anyone else in the room. When he spars with her, she doesn't really care whether or not he dislikes her. She doesn't think anything of it. She doesn't think enough of him to care whether he dislikes her. When he makes an effort on the walk to make sure she's not excluded, she just gambles away. Not thinking of anything other than finally getting Jane well enough to go back home. So it's utterly charming, because by now the reader has explicitly been told by the narrator that Darcy is bewitched. If we couldn't know that already, we're explicitly told that. But we know that Elizabeth is being by far the worst daughter that Mrs. Bennet could ever have, because she doesn't have any of the instincts that she needs or capitalize on at all. She's in a perfect position to get not only a husband just like Jane is going to do, but an infinitely wealthier husband. And she's ignoring it completely. He doesn't even know that it's happening. So we'll move on to chapter 11 next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.